Hey everyone, Kestrel here. Thanks for tuning in. I have a few scary stories for you this time. If you like this bunch, let me know down below. I won't keep you waiting any longer. Let's get to it. The night I took the job at Black Hollow Penitentiary, the air felt heavy, pressing down like a wet cloth against my skin. Thunderheads loomed in the distance, their jagged edges flickering with the first hints of a storm, and the narrow mountain road leading to the prison twisted through a dense, ancient forest that seemed to lean in, whispering secrets to the wind. I had been looking for steady work, something that paid better than the mind-numbing warehouse gig I just quit, and the Black Hollow had been hiring. The ad was simple: night shift security guard wanted, no experience necessary, room for advancement. It was the kind of offer you took if you had a patchy work history or a few black marks on your record, which made the job all the more appealing. I needed a fresh start. The prison itself was an ugly, sprawling thing, squatting at the end of the road like a beast in its lair. Its high, crumbling walls were draped in rusted barbed wire, the watchtowers standing like silent sentinels against the darkening sky. I parked my battered sedan in the nearly empty lot, the cracked asphalt glittering wetly under the weak, flickering floodlights. Inside, the air felt colder, tinged with the chemical sting of industrial cleaners and the faint, sour undercut of old sweat. The front desk guard, a grizzled man with thinning gray hair and eyes that looked permanently squinted, barely glanced up as I approached. "Name?" he grunted, scratching something into the logbook with a chewed-up pen. "Henry Blackwell," I replied, trying to keep the nerves out of my voice. He gave me a once-over, his eyes lingering on the crease of my shirt and second-hand boots I'd polished for the occasion. Then, with a sigh that suggested he'd long given up on finding competent help, he shoved a clipboard and a set of keys across the counter. "Warden's office is down the hall, third door on the left. He'll give you the rundown." I nodded, muttered a quick thanks, and made my way down the dimly lit corridor, the soles of my boots scuffing against the cracked, faded linoleum. The walls here were yellowed with age, patches of mold blooming in the corners like dark, malignant flowers. The warden's door stood slightly ajar, the brass nameplate tarnished and scratched. "Warden Isaac Ryder." I knocked, the sound echoing down the empty hall. "Come in," a gravely voice called from within. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. Ryder sat behind a massive, battered desk, his broad frame hunched over the stacked paperwork. His head was bowed, but his eyes, sharp and gray as river stones, snapped up to meet mine as soon as I entered. "Blackwell, right?" he said, leaning back in his chair with a creak that cut through the silence. He waved a hand at the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." I took a seat, the old wooden chair creaking under my weight. Ryder watched me for a long moment, his gaze heavy, as if weighing something. "You ever worked security before?" "No, sir," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. He grunted, running a calloused hand over his stubbled jaw. "Well, it's simple enough. You walk the floors, keep an eye out for trouble, make sure the prisoners stay where they're supposed to be. Most nights, it's just drunks and parole violators. A few lifers in solitary, but they keep to themselves." He leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. "There's just one thing you need to know. Some of the inmates here, they don't show up in the system. You might see them. You might even hear them talking. Ignore them." The air seemed to grow colder, the dim light flickering overhead as if something had passed between us. "Don't engage with them, Blackwell. Don't respond. Don't answer their questions. And whatever you do, don't make friends with them." I opened my mouth to ask what the hell he meant, but the words died on my tongue as his eyes met mine, a strange, hollow look settling into his gaze. He looked tired. No, more than that. Haunted. "Why?" I finally managed to croak, the single syllable scraping against my dry throat. Ryder's eyes held mine for a long, uncomfortable moment before he leaned back, his face slipping into the practiced mask of a man used to giving orders. "Just trust me. You'll understand soon enough." I left Ryder's office feeling the weight of his words pressing down on me, settling into my chest like wet concrete. The overhead lights buzzed and flickered as I made my way to the break room to grab my uniform, a stiff navy blue shirt with BHP embroidered over the left breast pocket, a matching cap, and a heavy brass flashlight that felt like it could double as a weapon if things ever got rough. I clipped my ID badge to my shirt and checked my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. My face looked pale, the dark bags under my eyes standing out starkly against my skin. I had never been a superstitious man, but something about this place had my nerves stretched thin. As I stepped into the main cell block, the air grew heavier, the distant clang of metal doors and the murmur of voices echoing off the stone walls. Rows of iron bars stretched down either side of the hallway, the cells beyond cloaked in shadows despite the weak flickering light. I passed a few inmates leaning against their cell doors, their eyes tracking me with the casual predatory interest of men who had nothing better to do. One of them, a wiry tattooed guy with a scar that split his eyebrow, gave me a nod as I passed. "New blood, huh?" he rasped, his voice rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. I forced a nod. My fingers tightened around the flashlight. "Yeah, first night." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Better get used to it. This place, it gets under your skin." I kept walking, my boots clapping against the cold concrete. I passed a few more cells, some occupied, others dark and silent. At the far end of the block, I paused, squinting into the gloom. There, leaning against the bars, was a man. He looked out of place, tall and lean, with neatly combed hair and sharp, angular features. His eyes were bright, almost feverish, and he wore a crisp, tailored suit that seemed impossibly clean for a place like this. He straightened as I approached, his thin lips curving into a slight, knowing smile. "Ah, the new guard," he said, his voice smooth, cultured, like someone who had once held a position of power. "You must be Henry." I felt a prickle of unease at the sound of my name. I hadn't introduced myself to anyone other than Ryder and the front desk guard. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone even. "How'd you know that?" He chuckled, a low rolling sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "I have an ear for names," he said, leaning closer to the bars, his thin, pale fingers curled around the iron. "An ear for many things." Something about his gaze, sharp, too intense, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at the small plaque beside his cell, expecting to see his name and inmate number, but the metal plate was blank. The screws rusted into place as if it hadn't been touched in decades. I hesitated, the weight of Ryder's warning fresh in my mind. Don't engage with them. Don't make friends. The man's smile grew wider, his teeth a little too perfect, a little too sharp. "I can see the gears turning, Henry," he whispered, his voice slipping through the bars like smoke. "You're wondering why my name isn't on that plaque, why my cell is so clean, why the others don't look my way." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Maybe you're just a neat freak." His eyes flashed, his smile stretching wider, revealing too many teeth. "Perhaps, or perhaps I'm just different." I forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the icy fingers creeping down my spine. I took a step back, the light from my flashlight trembling slightly as I tried to keep my composure. "Well, enjoy your evening," I muttered, turning on my heel and moving quickly down the hall, my boots ringing against the concrete. Behind me, I heard him chuckle again, the sound trailing after me like a shadow, curling into the dark corners of my mind. As I rounded the corner, I nearly collided with another guard, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a thick mustache and tired, bloodshot gaze. "Hey, watch it," he grumbled, and then squinted at me, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Oh, you the new guy?" "Yeah, Henry," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He glanced back down the corridor, his expression darkening. "You didn't talk to anyone down there, did you?" My pulse quickened, the strange man's too wide smile flashing through my mind. I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, just doing my rounds." The guard's eyes lingered on me for a moment longer, his jaw tightening as if he didn't quite believe me. "Good," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "Keep it that way. Some of the guys down here, They ain't exactly what they seem. He clapped me on the shoulder, his grip a little too tight, and then moved off, his heavy boots echoing down the corridor. I stood there for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest, the cold, damp air pressing in around me. The shadows seemed thicker here, the air heavier, and as I glanced back down the corridor, I saw the man in the suit watching me, his pale eyes glinting from the darkness. He lifted one hand in a slow, mocking wave. I turned away, forcing myself to keep walking, even as the echo of his voice whispered through my mind, the sound stretching out into the cold, silent halls of Black Hollow. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the cell block, my breath fogging slightly in the flickering light. The cells around me seemed to close in, the bars casting long, thin shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the cracked concrete floor. As I reached the second tier, a low, rhythmic clinking caught my attention, the sound of metal against metal, slow and deliberate. I paused, shining my flashlight down the next row of cells. At first, I saw nothing, just darkened cells, their iron doors standing slightly ajar, the shadows within pooling like spilled ink, and then movement. In the far corner, a creature sat cross-legged on the cold, stained floor, his back to me. His head was bowed, shoulders hunched, the faint clinking sound coming from the rusty set of manacles around his wrists as he slowly scraped them against the iron bars. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing down the empty hall. "You're supposed to be locked up." The scraping stopped. The figure shifted, his head tilting slightly to the side, the dark matted hair clinging to his scalp like wet seaweed. For a long, breathless moment, he sat perfectly still, his back rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. I took a cautious step closer, my flashlight beam catching the jagged edges of his shackles, the rust flaking away like dry blood. "You hear me?" I said, forcing a bit more authority into my tone. "You're not supposed to be out." Slowly, almost reluctantly, the figure turned. His face was pale, eyes sunken and rimmed with dark shadows, his lips cracked and bloody. He blinked at the harsh beam of my flashlight, his head twitching slightly as if the light hurt his eyes. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I recognized him. I'd seen his picture in one of the old faded mugshots that lined the walls near the warden's office, a notorious killer from the 1970s, known for a string of brutal murders across the Midwest, the kind of man who made headlines for his sheer, remorseless brutality. But that didn't make sense. That man had died in the electric chair decades ago. "Hey," I stammered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. How are you out of your cell?" The man's cracked lips twitched into a faint, twisted smile, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "Didn't they tell you?" he rasped, his voice dry as dead leaves. "This place keeps its own kind of time." I took a step back, my pulse roaring in my ears. The man leaned closer, his chains clinking softly as he wrapped his thin, bony fingers around the iron bars. "It's not just the living that walks these halls," he whispered, his breath misting in the cold air, the faint stench of rot curling into my nostrils. "And if you're smart, you'll keep your head down, mind your business, and never ever talk to the ones that don't belong." My flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as if the darkness itself had reached out to brush against the glass. When the light steadied, the cell was empty. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was gone, the chains lying in a loose, rust-stained coil on the floor, the iron bars trembling slightly as if something had just brushed past them. I took a stumbling step backwards, my boot catching on a crack in the concrete, nearly sending me sprawling. No, this had to be a trick, a setup, some twisted prank to rattle the new guy. I straightened, swallowing the rising bile in my throat, my flashlight beam sweeping across the now empty cell. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and forcing myself to keep moving, the shadows around me growing longer, their edges sharper, like the teeth of some great unseen predator. I had just reached the end of the corridor, my mind still racing with what I'd just seen, or thought I'd seen, when a low melodic humming reached my ears, drifting through the dark like a long-forgotten tune. I paused, my heart hammering against my ribs, the sound seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The rust-stained walls seemed to close in, their rough, cracked surfaces pulsing faintly in the dim light. At the far end of the block, just past the rusted, sagging gates that marked the boundary of the maximum security wing, a woman stood, her long, dark hair hanging in tangled strands around her face, her thin, white hospital gown fluttering slightly in the cold, still air. She was facing away from me, her bare feet leaving faint, wet prints on the cold concrete, the sound of her soft, mournful humming echoing off the stone walls like the whispered plea of a forgotten soul. I opened my mouth to call out, my voice catching in my throat as the light flickered again. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist in the corners of my vision. When the beam steadied, the woman was gone. The hallway stood empty, the rusted gates creaking softly in the wind that drifted in from somewhere deep within the prison's guts. I stumbled back, the air growing colder, the distant clanging of metal doors and the low, whispered murmurs of unseen voices filling my ears. I turned and fled, my boots ringing against the stone floor, the sound of my own ragged breathing filling my head as I crashed through the heavy, rusted door at the end of the corridor, the metal slamming shut behind me with a teeth-rattling clang. I leaned against the cold, unforgiving wall, my heart racing, the taste of copper sharp on my tongue. I'd only been on the job for a few hours, and already I felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows reaching out, the whispers growing louder. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, I swore I heard that low melodic humming again, drifting through the cold stone walls, like the lullaby for the damned. I didn't slow down until I reached the stairwell, the metal steps clanging beneath my boots as I stumbled down, my flashlight beam jittering against the cracked, water-stained walls. I burst through the door into the main hallway, the cold, clammy air clinging to my skin like a shroud. I paused, leaning against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I could still hear the faint melodic humming echoing in my mind, like the forgotten song that clung to the corners of my thoughts, refusing to be shaken loose. I needed answers. The warden's office was just down the hall, the heavy wooden door standing slightly ajar, the faint glow of his desk lamp spilling into the hallway. I forced myself to move, each step feeling like it took a piece of my resolve, my hand tightening around the brass flashlight until my knuckles ached. I reached the door, hesitating for a moment, my heart racing before I pushed it open and stepped inside. Warden Ryder looked up from his paperwork, his sharp gray eyes narrowing as he took in my pale, sweat-soaked face. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking beneath his weight, and he set his pencil down with a slow, deliberate motion. "Something on your mind, Blackwell?" he asked, his voice flat, his eyes hard as polished stones. I closed the door behind me, the sound echoing through the small, cluttered office, the shadows stretching long and thin across the faded, peeling wallpaper. I saw something, I managed to choke out, my throat dry, the taste of copper still sharp on my tongue. Up in the second tier, a man in shackles, and a woman. She was humming, just standing there, in a hospital gown. Ryder's eyes darkened, the faint lines around his mouth tightening. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the cluttered surface of his desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Did you speak to them?" I hesitated, the image of the suited man's too sharp smile flashing through my mind. "No," I lied, the word catching in my throat like a splinter. I thought maybe someone had gotten out, or..." Ryder's fist slammed down onto the desk, a sound like a gunshot in the tight, confined space. "Don't lie to me, Blackwell," he growled, his eyes locking onto mine with a ferocity that stole my breath from my lungs. "Did you speak to them?" I felt the cold, clammy weight of fear settle into my bones, my fingers trembling around the brass flashlight. "Just one," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. A man in a suit. He knew my name. Ryder's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck standing out like steel cables beneath his leathery skin. He let out a slow, measured breath, his eyes never leaving mine. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning gray beard, his fingers trembling slightly as they passed over his scalp. "I warned you. I told you not to talk to them." I opened my mouth to protest, to demand answers, but he cut me off with a sharp, slicing motion of his hand. "No, you listen to me, Blackwell, and you listen good," he hissed, his eyes gleaming with a hard, desperate light. "This place, it's not like other prisons. It's old, older than the walls, older than the iron bars, older than the men who built it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, his breath hot and sour against my face. "There are things in these walls, things that don't belong, things that slipped through the cracks in the world and found their way here. They feed on the fear, the pain, the rage of the men locked up in these cells, and if you let them, they'll feed on you too." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, the tiny hairs on my arms standing on end. "But they're just ghosts, right?" I stammered, the word feeling small and foolish in the heavy, oppressive air of the office. Ryder's eyes narrowed, his lips pulling back into a thin, humorless smile. "Ghosts? You wish," he said, leaning back into his chair, the old wood groaning beneath him. "Ghosts are just echoes, memories, harmless if you know how to ignore them. But these things, they're more than that. They're predators, parasites. They'll twist your mind, feed on your fears, wear your skin like a cheap suit." He reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, the old wood screeching in protest, and pulled out a battered, leather-bound journal, the cover cracked and stained with age. "Take this," he said, shoving the journal across the desk, his eyes hard as granite. "Read it. Learn the names. If you're smart, you'll quit before they take an interest in you, before they decide you're worth keeping." I took the journal, the leather rough and cracked beneath my fingers, my pulse still hammering in my ears. "But what are they?" I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "What the hell are they?" Ryder leaned back, his eyes dark and hollow, his face shadowed in the dim light of the desk lamp. "They're the Forgotten," he said, his voice low and bitter, the words slipping through his teeth like a curse. "The ones the world erased, the men who died screaming in these walls, their souls too twisted to find peace." He paused, his eyes flickering to the narrow, dust-streaked window behind me, the faint sound of distant, mournful humming drifting up through the cold stone halls. "And if you're smart, Blackwell," he added, his voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper, "you'll keep your mouth shut, your head down, and you'll never, ever speak to them again." I left the warden's office feeling the weight of the journal in my hand, the leather rough and cracked against my palm. The cold fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed overhead, casting long flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as I passed, their edges too sharp, too jagged, like teeth waiting to snap shut. I wanted to get out of there, to grab my coat, walk out the front gate, and never look back. But something kept me moving deeper into the prison, my boots ringing against the cracked linoleum, the cold air prickling against my skin. I turned a corner, the rusted sagging bars of the maximum security wing coming into view. I hesitated, the weight of the journal pulling at my hand, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I glanced down at the cover, the dark oil-stained leather marked with deep, jagged scratches, like something with sharp, desperate claws had tried to tear it open. I flipped it open with a shaking hand, the pages yellowed and brittle, the cramped, spidery handwriting slanting across the paper like the desperate ramblings of a madman. October 3rd, 1952. They're watching me, whispering. I can feel their eyes on my back, their cold, dead breath against my neck. They know my secrets. They know my fears. I can't sleep. I can't breathe. I can't. The line ended in a jagged, ink-streaked scrawl, the pen digging so deeply into the page that it had torn through the paper. I swallowed, the taste of copper still sharp on my tongue, and I turned the page. October 10th, 1952. I saw her again last night, the woman in the gown. She stood at the end of my cot, her hair hanging in wet, tangled strands around her face, her lips moving, but no sound coming out. She reached for me, her fingers long and thin, the bones sharp beneath the pale, withered skin. I tried to scream, but my voice died in my throat, my breath frozen in my lungs. She leaned in, her cold, wet hair brushing against my cheek, and whispered a name, my name, over and over, like a prayer. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I remembered the woman I had seen earlier, her long, dark hair, her bare feet leaving faint, wet prints on the cold concrete floor. I flipped through a few more pages, my fingers trembling, the words blurring together. The journal was filled with desperate, frantic entries, the handwriting growing more jagged, more desperate, the ink smeared and streaked with something darker, something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. And then, near the back of the journal, I found a list. Names, dozens of them, scrawled in the same cramped, frantic handwriting. Some of them were crossed out, the ink smeared, as if the writer had dragged his pen across the page in a fit of blind panic. I scanned the list, my eyes catching on a name I recognized. Carter Delaney. My blood ran cold. That was the name of the man in the suit, the one who had known my name, who had smiled at me through the bars, his teeth too sharp, his eyes too bright. I took a stumbling step back, the journal slipping from my grasp and landing on the cold, cracked linoleum with a muffled thud. The sound seemed to echo through the hall, the shadows stretching and writhing around me, the air growing colder, the faint, mournful humming drifting up from the lower levels. I looked up, my heart hammering in my chest, the taste of bile rising in my throat. The hallway stretched out before me, the iron bars of the cells casting long, jagged shadows against the cracked walls, the distant flickering light making the darkness seem thicker, more solid, like the black viscous ink that had stained the pages of the journal. And then I saw him, Carter Delaney, standing at the far end of the hall, his suit crisp and clean, his thin, pale fingers curled around the iron bars, his too wide smile stretching across his sharp, angular face. He met my eyes, his head tilting slightly to the side, his eyes glinting in the darkness like a predator's, his teeth bared into a grin that was all sharp angles and dark intent. He lifted one hand, the motion slow and deliberate, his fingers stretching wide, the joints cracking like breaking bones. He beckoned to me, his fingers curling in a slow, mocking invitation, his eyes never leaving mine. I took a stumbling step back, my boot catching on the edge of the dropped journal, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "No," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. "No, you're not real. You can't be real." Carter's smile stretched wider, his teeth gleaming in the darkness, his eyes flashing with a cold, unnatural light. "Oh, but I am, Henry," he whispered, his voice slipping through the iron bars like smoke, curling around me, slipping into my ears, my mind, my soul. "I'm as real as you make me." The lights overhead flickered, the shadows deepening, the walls seeming to close in around me, the cold air pressing against my skin like a wet shroud. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor, the beam rolling wildly across the cracked, stained linoleum, the darkness rushing in to fill the void. And then, With a sharp echoing clang, the cell door at the far end of the hall swung open, the rusted hinges screeching in protest, the sound slicing through the cold, silent air like a knife. Carter stepped out, his polished shoes tapping softly against the concrete, his long, pale fingers trailing along the rusted iron bars as he moved closer, his eyes locked onto mine, his smile never faltering. I turned and ran, my boots ringing against the cracked, uneven floors, the darkness closing in around me, the cold, silent whispers of the forgotten souls of Black Hollow echoing in my mind as I fled, their hollow, desperate voices clawing at the edges of my sanity. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, I heard that low, melodic humming again, the sound slipping through the cold walls like a whispered promise of things to come. My pulse thundered in my ears, the sharp echoing clang of the cell door ringing in my mind as I tore down the hallway, the journal forgotten on the cold, cracked floor behind me. My boots slammed against the concrete, the darkness pressing in around me like a living thing. I skidded around a corner, my shoulders slamming into the rough, rust-streaked wall, the cold, damp air biting into my lungs. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see those two sharp teeth, those eyes that gleamed like polished glass in a flickering light. I stumbled down the stairway, my footsteps echoing off the cracked, crumbling walls, the rusted iron railing biting into my palm as I half ran, half fell down the steps. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker, the distant, mournful humming slipping through the darkness like a whispered promise. I burst into the main hall, my boots ringing against the cracked, uneven tiles, the flickering, buzzing fluorescent lights overhead casting long, jagged shadows that twisted and writhed along the walls like the grasping fingers of the forgotten. The front gate loomed ahead, the heavy, rusted metal bars standing tall and imposing, the faint gray light of a storm-streaked night spilling through the narrow barred windows high above. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly that they clinked together in a desperate, stuttering chorus. I reached the gate, my fingers slipping against the cold, rusted metal as I tried to fit the key into the lock, my heart hammering in my chest, the taste of copper sharp on my tongue. The lock clicked, the heavy, rusted bolt sliding back with a deep, echoing groan that seemed to vibrate through the bones of the building, the walls around me shuddering as if in protest. I threw the gate open, the metal shrieking as I stumbled through, the cold night air stinging my skin, the distant rumble of thunder rolling through the darkness like the growl of some great unseen beast. I staggered down the steps, my boots slipping on the rain-slicked concrete, my heart still roaring. The cracked, weed-choked parking lot stretched out before me, my battered sedan sitting at the far end, its dented, rusting frame gleaming wetly in the dim, flickering light of the prison's failing floodlights. I bolted for the car, my keys clutched so tightly in my fist that the jagged metal edges bit into my palm, drawing thin, stinging lines of blood. I reached the door, my fingers slipping against the cold, wet metal as I jammed the key into the lock, the old rusted mechanism grinding as I wrenched it open and threw myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the door, the sound echoing through the empty lot, the rain pattering against the cracked streaked windshield, the shadows beyond the glass stretching and twisting like long grasping fingers. My hands shook as I shoved the key into the ignition, the engine coughing and sputtering before roaring to life, the old battered sedan vibrating beneath me as the headlights flickered on, casting long thin beams of light across the cracked, weed-choked pavement. I threw the car into reverse, the tires skidding across the wet concrete as I backed out of the space. I twisted the wheel, the tires screeching against the rain-slicked pavement as I whipped the car around, the front gate of the prison shrinking in the rearview mirror, the dark, hulking shape of the building looming against the storm-streaked sky like a jagged, broken tooth. I hit the gas, the engine roaring as I sped down the narrow, winding mountain road, the headlights slicing through the darkness, the rain streaking against the windshield in long, blurred lines. For a brief, desperate moment, I allowed myself hope, to believe that I had escaped, and that I had broken free of the prison's grasp. that I had outrun the dark, grasping shadows and the cold, whispering voices that clawed at the edges of my mind. But then, as I rounded a sharp, rain-slicked corner, my headlights caught on something. A tall, rusted iron gate, the thick, heavy bars streaked with dark rust stains, the narrow barred windows of Black Hollow looming behind it, the dark, hulking shape of the prison rising against the storm-soaked sky like a nightmare made flesh. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding against the wet pavement, the engine sputtering and coughing as I came to a shuddering halt, the cold, damp air pressing in around me, the shadows stretching long and thin across the rain-slicked road. I stared through the cracked windshield, my fingers tightening around the worn steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I was back in the prison's shadow, back at the gates of Black Hollow. The rain pattered softly against the glass, the wipers squeaking against the cracked, streaked windshield, the shadows beyond the glass shifting and twisting. Their dark, jagged shapes seemed to stretch toward the car, their long, grasping fingers reaching for me. I let out a low, shuddering breath, the taste of copper sharp on my tongue, my pulse thundering in my ears as the cold, wet air slipped through the cracks in the door, chilling my skin, my breath fogging in the dim, flickering light. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, I heard that low, melodic humming again, the sound slipping through the darkness like a whispered promise, like the slow, rhythmic clinking of rusted chains against cold iron bars. I let my head fall against the steering wheel, the darkness slipping through the cracked, rain-streaked windows, the cold, clammy air pressing against my skin like the grasping hands of the forgotten. And then, as the cold, whispering voices rose up around me, I felt a thin, cold hand rest gently on my shoulder, the long, bony fingers curling around the stiff fabric of my uniform, the touch as light as breath, as cold as the grave. A voice, smooth and cultured, whispered in my ear, the breath cold and sharp against my skin. "Welcome back, Henry." I still remember the night it all began. My apartment, a cramped one-bedroom unit on the edge of the city, felt different that evening. The air hung thick with the stale scent of incense and the oppressive heat of too many candles burning at once. I had spent hours meticulously preparing the space, dragging my battered old rug to the side and scrubbing the cracked tiles beneath until they gleamed in the flickering light. I had found the ritual in the forgotten corners of the internet, a place where modern cynicism meets ancient superstition. The PDF, crudely translated from some long-dead tongue, promised the way to reach the divine, to call down an angelic being that could heal the sick and mend the broken. I had clicked the download link out of desperation, my mind clouded by weeks of sleepless nights, my heart heavy with worry for my mother. She had been fading for months, her body withering beneath thin hospital sheets, her voice reduced to a fragile whisper. The doctors had no answers, the tests revealing nothing but the slow, relentless decay of someone slipping through the cracks of modern medicine. I couldn't stand it. The thought of losing her, of standing by helplessly as she drifted further from the vibrant woman I had known, was unbearable. So I had convinced myself that the ritual was worth the risk, that the whispered warnings in the forum threads were nothing but the ramblings of bored fantasists and basement-dwelling conspiracy theorists. I ignored the posts that spoke of things coming through the veil with too many eyes and too few faces. I brushed off the cryptic warnings about the price of light and the hunger of wings. Instead, I had focused on the promise of salvation. The instructions were simple enough: a circle of white candles, a bowl of purified water, and the smoke of frankincense to carry my words into the ether. I drew the sigil on the floor with trembling hands, chalk lines uneven but precise enough, I hoped, to draw the attention of something pure. I checked my phone one last time, the screen flickering in the candlelight. It was just past midnight, the hour the ritual demanded. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath, and began to chant. Aveniat lumen, illuminit casum, aperiat portam intermundos. The words felt wrong in my mouth, their syllables sharp and angular like broken glass. I forced myself to continue, my voice a thin, strained whisper as the air in the room grew heavier, pressing down on my shoulders like an unseen weight. Audi vocem meam, o angelus clementiae, descende ad me. The candles flickered, their flames stretching and bending as if caught in a sudden gust, though the air remained still. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, a cold so sharp it cut through the humid heat of the room. My breath fogged in the air, a thin wispy cloud that quickly dissipated as the temperature plummeted. The shadows cast by the flickering flames twisted, stretching across the walls like grasping fingers, their movements discordant with the steady crackling light. For a moment, I considered abandoning the ritual, snuffing out the candles and scrubbing the chalk from the tiles. But before I could move, a low resonant hum filled the room. It came not from the air around me, but from the very walls, the plaster and brick vibrating with a deep, bone-shaking frequency that set my teeth on edge. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, as the light from the candles grew brighter, their white flames tinged with a faint sickly green. The smoke from the incense coiled in the air, forming intricate spiraling patterns that seemed to twist in on themselves, vanishing into the darkness above. And then, with a sudden blinding flash, the circle erupted into a burst of light so intense I staggered back, shielding my eyes as the air crackled with the sharp metallic scent of ozone. When I dared to lower my arm, my breath caught in my throat. There, within the circle, something moved. The figure that emerged from the circle was not what I had imagined. I had expected something radiant, something that would flood my tiny apartment with divine light, banishing the shadows that clung to the corners like cobwebs. Instead, the being that stood before me was a tall, slender creature, its head nearly brushing the cracked ceiling. Its form shimmering in the candlelight, a vaguely humanoid silhouette wrapped in a rippling, translucent cloak that seemed to shift and flow like smoke in a breeze. Its limbs were too long, the joints bending at strange, unsettling angles, but its movements were fluid, almost graceful, as it slowly straightened and turned to face me. Its face, if you could call it that, was a smooth, featureless oval, a blank mask of pale, softly glowing flesh. It had no eyes, no mouth, no features at all, yet I felt its gaze upon me, a pressure against my mind like a hand resting lightly on the back of my head. For a long moment, we simply stood there, the only sounds being the crackling of the candles and the soft rhythmic hum that seemed to resonate from the being itself. My fear, sharp and icy in my veins, began to melt under the warmth radiating from the figure. It wasn't the oppressive heat of the candles, but something gentler, more comforting, like the first rays of morning sunlight after a long, cold night. I felt my knees tremble, and I sank to the floor, my legs refusing to hold me any longer. Are you the angel I called?" I managed to whisper, my voice weak and trembling. The being inclined its head, the movement slow and deliberate, as if considering my words. And then, without sound or breath, it spoke, its voice unfurling within my mind like the whisper of 1,000 soft rustling wings. "I have heard your call, and I have come." Relief crashed over me, a wave so intense I felt tears welling in my eyes. I had done it. I had reached across the void and called down something holy, something powerful. I need your help," I choked out, my words tumbling over each other in my desperation. "My mother, she's dying. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. I'll do anything, give anything, if you can save her." The being stepped forward, its movements impossibly silent, the edges of its cloak rippling and curling as it crossed the boundary of the circle without hesitation. I flinched, a part of my mind screaming that this was wrong, that no being should cross the threshold of a protective circle so easily. But that part of me was quickly drowned out by the deep, aching need for a miracle. The figure extended one slender arm, its fingers stretching impossibly long, tapering to fine, delicate points that hovered inches from my face. I felt a warmth radiate from them, a gentle, comforting heat that spread through my chest, soothing the frantic hammering of my heart. "You would give anything?" it whispered, the words sliding through my thoughts like a knife through silk. "You would offer your very soul to see her well again?" I hesitated, the weight of the question settling over me like a shroud. My soul, the part of me that, if the old stories were to be believed, would endure long after my body had crumbled to dust. But the memory of my mother's fragile, trembling hand grasping mine in that sterile hospital room filled my mind, her eyes dull and unfocused, her voice no more than a raspy whisper as she tried to tell me not to worry, that everything would be all right. "Yes," I whispered, my voice breaking on the single desperate word. "Yes, I'd give anything." The being's fingers brushed my cheek, the touch as light as a breath of wind, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through my veins, banishing the last lingering threads of doubt. "Then it shall be so," it whispered, its head tilting in what I could only assume was a gesture of approval. "Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." A pulse of warmth surged through me, spreading from my chest to the tips of my fingers, filling me with a strange euphoric lightness that brought a dazed, breathless smile to my lips. I felt my worries, my fears, my doubts, all melt away beneath the gentle, incessant warmth of the being's touch. And as I sank into that warmth, I felt the first stirrings of hope, a fragile, trembling thing that bloomed in the depths of my heart like a flower pushing its way through the cracks in the pavement. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that everything might actually be okay. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of birdsong. It took me a moment to remember that I hadn't heard birds outside my window in months. The city had a way of drowning out anything natural, replacing the songs of sparrows with the distant mechanical grind of engines and the low constant hum of electrical wires. I pushed myself up, rubbing the grit of broken sleep from my eyes. My apartment felt different, warmer. The heavy, cloying scent of incense still clung in the air, but it had taken on a sweeter note. Less like burning resin and more like fresh blossoms on a spring morning. For a moment, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the chalk circle on the living room floor. The candles had burned down to blackened stumps, their melted wax spreading across the tiles like the roots of some twisted, petrified tree. But the circle itself remained intact, the lines of white chalk stark and unbroken against the dark floor. The figure was gone. A flicker of panic tightened in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe, to focus. I had called it here. I had begged for its help. It had promised to save my mother. I should be relieved that it was no longer lurking in the corner, its featureless face tilted in silent, unreadable judgment. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I reached for it with trembling fingers, my heart lurching as I saw my sister's name on the screen. She never called this early. "Hello?" I croaked, my voice rough and dry. "Jason." Her voice was thin, trembling with a kind of emotion I had forced myself to stop feeling months ago. "Jason, you need to come to the hospital. Mom, she's awake." I felt the world tilt beneath me, the edges of my vision blurring as the words sank in. I had to press my free hand against the wall to steady myself, my pulse thundering in my ears. "What? How?" I stammered, my mind scrambling to catch up with the impossible reality my sister had just dropped into my lap. Is she okay?" There was a moment of hesitation on the other line, the kind of uncertain silence that speaks volumes. "She's awake. She's talking. You just need to come," my sister said over the phone with a hesitation. I didn't bother showering. I threw on some clothes I had worn the day before, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my keys twice on the way to the door. The air outside felt different too, sharper, crisper, the sunlight more vibrant, as if the entire world had been dialed up a notch in my absence. I tried to ignore the way the shadows stretched longer than they should have, the way the air seemed to whisper against my skin as I hurried down the sidewalk, The hospital loomed ahead, its cold concrete facade a jarring contrast to the warmth that clung to my skin like a second layer. I stumbled through the automatic doors, my heart a frantic stuttering drumbeat as I made my way to the elevator. When I reached my mother's room, my sister was already there, her eyes red-rimmed and glassy with tears. She looked up as I entered, her lips parting in a small, disbelieving smile. "Jason," she whispered, stepping aside to reveal the figure sitting up in the hospital bed. Her thin, frail frame propped against a mound of starched white pillows. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mother was awake. Her eyes, once clouded and sunken, were now bright and clear, the same deep, piercing green I remembered from my childhood. Her hair, which had thinned to wispy gray strands, had regained some of its old luster, a hint of chestnut shining through the silver. She turned to look at me, her lips curving into a small, hesitant smile, and I felt my heart lurch in my chest. "Jason," she said, her voice stronger than I had heard in years, though tinged with a strange, hollow echo that sent a chill skittering down my spine. "It's good to see you." I crossed the room in 3 long strides, dropping to my knees beside the bed and grasping her hand in mine. Her skin was warm, too warm, and the pulse that thudded beneath my fingertips felt wrong, too slow. But in that moment, I didn't care. I clung to her hand, pressed it against my cheek as tears blurred my vision. "You're awake," I choked out, my voice breaking on the words. "You're really awake." She reached out with her free hand, brushing her fingers through my hair in a gesture that should have felt comforting, but instead sent a cold, prickling sensation creeping down my spine. "Of course I am, sweetheart," she whispered, her smile widening, the skin around her mouth stretching too tightly, too perfectly. "I told you I'd be all right." My sister touched my shoulder, her grip firm but trembling. I looked up at her, expecting to see the same relief, the same tear-streaked joy I felt, but instead I only saw confusion, a faint flickering doubt that mirrored my own. For a moment, the room felt too small, the air too thick, the fluorescent lights above casting harsh, unnatural shadows that crawled along the walls with the legs of some unseen creature. I forced myself to smile, to swallow the bitter tang of fear rising in my throat, and squeezed my mother's hand. "I'm so glad you're back," I whispered, trying to ignore the way her fingers twitched beneath my touch. Too strong. And as her grip tightened around my hand, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt almost predatory, I felt the first cold stirrings of doubt. That first day felt like a dream. I spent hours at my mother's bedside, clinging to her hand as she spoke to me in a voice that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. She laughed at my terrible jokes, her eyes crinkling at the corners just like they used to, and told me stories from my childhood, moments I had all but forgotten, memories I had convinced myself were lost to the fog of her illness. My sister eventually excused herself, muttering something about needing fresh air, but I barely noticed her leave. I was too wrapped up in the small, precious moments of normalcy that had become so rare over the past few years. As the hours stretched into the afternoon, the fluorescent lights above cast long, sharp shadows across the hospital room, their edges too crisp, too dark, as if the light itself were struggling to penetrate the thick, humid air. I tried to ignore the way my mother's eyes lingered on me, the way her gaze felt too heavy, too focused, like the stare of a predator watching its prey. But when she spoke, her voice was warm, her words threaded with the soft, musical lilt I had missed so much. "You've been so strong, Jason," she said, her hand reaching out to brush my cheek, her touch a cool, unsettling contrast to the warmth of the room. "I am so proud of you." I swallowed the lump in my throat, leaning into her touch despite the faint electric tingle that prickled beneath my skin. "I missed you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know if I'd ever get to talk to you again." She smiled, her lips stretching a fraction too wide, her teeth gleaming too white, too sharp in the dim light. "I'm here now," she murmured, her eyes never leaving mine, their green depths flickering with a strange inner light. "And I'll never leave you again." The words, meant to comfort, instead sent a chill skittering down my spine, a cold primal fear that twisted in my gut like a knife. That evening I took her home. The doctors hadn't argued, their eyes wide and glassy with disbelief as they watched her rise from the hospital bed and stretch her limbs like a cat, her movements fluid and precise, without the slightest hint of the frailty that had defined her final moments. She walked out of that sterile white room without a second glance, her bare feet whispering against the cold linoleum as she moved with a confidence and grace I hadn't seen in years. The nurses stepped back as she passed, their eyes tracking her every movement, their faces pale and drawn beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. I felt a swell of pride as I guided her to my car, the cool evening air wrapping around us like blankets as I helped her into the passenger seat. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was over. Back in my apartment, I settled her into the worn, threadbare couch, fussing over her like a nervous parent, fluffing the flattened cushions and fetching a warm knitted blanket from the closet. She smiled at me, her head tilted in that same slightly off-kilter way, her eyes tracking my every movement with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I can make you some tea," I offered, my voice too loud in the small cluttered space. "Or soup if you're hungry. I can order something in if you want. Just say the word." She watched me for a long moment, her head cocked to the side like a curious bird, her eyes unblinking. "Tea would be nice," she said finally, her lips curling into that too wide smile. I fled to the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs as I filled the kettle, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it twice before setting it onto the stove. I fumbled with the tea bags, the paper packets crinkling loudly in the too quiet room, the sound sharp and grating against my nerves. As the kettle began to hiss and steam, I glanced over my shoulder, my pulse skipping a beat as I caught sight of her reflection in the window above the sink. She was still sitting on the couch, her head tilted back, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Her mouth hung slightly open, her chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths, each one so measured, so precise, it felt more like a performance than a natural act. For a moment, I thought I saw her fingers twitch, her long, slender hands clenching and unclenching at her sides, movements sharp and jerky, like a marionette's strings pulled too tightly. I blinked, and the moment passed, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her head slowly turning to meet my gaze through the glass. Her eyes, even in the reflection, seemed too bright, the green irises glinting with a predatory hunger that set my teeth on edge. The kettle shrieked, a sound so sudden and piercing that I nearly dropped my mug, the scalding water splashing across my knuckles as I fumbled with the handle. I cursed under my breath, the pain sharp and immediate, but when I looked back at the window, my mother was smiling, her head still tilted at that unnatural angle, her eyes locked onto mine through the darkened glass. The first night back in my apartment was a strange one. My mother moved through the cramped space with the same slow, deliberate grace I had noticed in the hospital, her bare feet whispering against the cool tile as she drifted from room to room, her head tilting at odd angles as she examined the cluttered shelves and peeling wallpaper. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, pouring her tea and setting out a plate of crackers and fruit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that her eyes were on me even when I wasn't looking. At one point, I caught her standing in the hallway, her head tilted back as she stared at the ceiling again, her lips moving soundlessly, her fingers twitching in slow, rhythmic patterns at her sides. I froze, the plate clattering in my hands, and her head snapped around to face me, her eyes too wide, too bright in the dim, flickering light. "Mom," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. Are you all right?" She blinked, her expression smoothed into a placid, gentle smile, the tension bleeding from her frame in an instant. "Of course, sweetheart," she murmured, gliding into the kitchen with that same unnatural grace, her movements too fluid. "I'm just so happy to be home." She took the plate from my hands, her fingers brushing mine for a brief chilling moment. The coolness of her touch sent shivers racing down my spine. "I've missed this," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine, their green depths glinting with something sharp and hungry. I've missed you. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her whispering from the living room, her soft crooning voice weaving through the darkness like a thread pulled too tight. I told myself it was just the creak of the old pipes, the groan of the ancient building settling in the cool night air, but the sounds had a rhythm, a strange, lilting cadence that set my teeth on edge. At one point, I forced myself to sit up, my pulse a frantic, erratic drumbeat in my ears. I crept to the door, my breath coming in shallow, trembling gasps as I peered into the dimly lit hallway. She was there, standing in the center of the living room, her head tilted back, her arms stretched out to either side, her fingers twitching in slow, deliberate patterns. Her mouth moved soundlessly, her eyes half closed, the pale skin on her face gleaming in the flickering light of the street lamp outside the window. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the darkness behind her, a shifting, rippling shadow that clung to the walls like a stain, its edges fraying and curling like burnt paper. I blinked and the shadow was gone, the room empty save for my mother's swaying, whispering form. The next morning I awoke to the smell of burning. I bolted upright, my heart thundering in my chest, and stumbled into the kitchen, my bare feet slapping against the cold tile. My mother stood at the stove, her back to me, a pan of charred, blackened bacon sizzling in her grip. The air was thick with greasy smoke, the sharp, acrid stench clawing at my throat as I staggered to the window, fumbling with the rusted latch until it finally groaned open, the cool morning air rushing in like a gasp of relief. "Mom, what are you doing?" I choked out, weaving a hand through the thick, swirling smoke. She turned to face me, the pan still clutched in her slender, pale fingers, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth stretched into that same too wide smile. "Breakfast," she whispered, her voice too bright and too cheerful, her words echoing strangely in the small, smoke-choked kitchen. "I thought you might be hungry." I forced myself to smile, my lips trembling as I reached out to take the pan from her. "Let me handle this," I said, my voice tight with a forced calm. "Why don't you sit down? I'll make us something a bit less, well done." She hesitated, her head tilting to the side in that familiar, unsettling way, her eyes tracking my movements with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Of course, sweetheart," she murmured, her smile widening as she set the pan down on the counter with the sharp metallic clang. "You've always taken such good care of me." I watched her drift back to the couch, her bare feet whispering against the tiles, her long, slender fingers trailing across the wall as she passed, leaving faint, dark smudges in her wake. I gripped the edge of the counter, my pulse racing, my skin tingling with the sharp, bitter tang of fear. Something was wrong. I forced myself to breathe, to focus, to push the thought down, to bury it deep beneath the fragile, trembling hope that had brought me this far. But as I watched her settle onto the couch, her eyes tracking my every movement with that same unblinking stare, I felt the first cold stirrings of dread. Over the next few days, the strangeness only deepened. My mother's behavior grew more unsettling, her movements too fluid, too precise, each step too deliberate, as if she were rehearsing her every action. She moved through my apartment like a cat through tall grass, silent and watchful, her head always tilted at that slightly unnatural angle, her eyes tracking my every movement even when I wasn't directly looking at her. I tried to ignore it, tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me after so many sleepless nights. But the feeling of her gaze, that prickling electric sensation that crawled up my spine whenever her eyes found me, was impossible to shake. I started catching glimpses of her in reflective surfaces, her head tilting too sharply, her lips moving when no sound passed between them, her fingers curling and uncurling in slow rhythmic patterns, as if she were counting something only she can see. One night I stumbled into the kitchen for a glass of water, the floor cold beneath my bare feet, the air thick with the lingering scent of burnt bacon and incense. I reached for the light switch, but hesitated, the darkness around me feeling too dense, too heavy, like the air before a storm. I glanced toward the living room, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim gray light filtering in through the blinds. My mother sat on the couch, her back to me, her head tilted back, her eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling. Her lips moving soundlessly, her hands resting in her lap, the fingers twitching and curling in slow, deliberate movements, each one perfectly timed to the shallow rise and fall of her chest. I felt the cold metallic taste of fear pull in the back of my throat. My pulse was frantic. I took a step back, the floor creaking beneath my weight, and her head snapped around, her eyes locking onto mine with a speed and precision that sent a jolt of terror racing down my spine. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, her green eyes glinting like an animal's in the darkness, their pupils dilated to narrow vertical slits that reflected the dim flickering light like polished glass. "Couldn't sleep?" she whispered, her voice low and melodic, the words curling around my thoughts like a creeping vine. I forced myself to smile, my lips trembling, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "Yeah," I croaked, my voice too loud in the small silent space. Just thirsty." She smiled, her teeth gleaming too white, too sharp in the darkness, and turned back to the ceiling, her fingers resuming their slow rhythmic dance. I stumbled back to my room, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as I fumbled for the door handle, the cold metal biting into my palm as I shoved the door shut behind me. For a long time, I stood there in the darkness, my back pressed against the cold, unforgiving wood, my heart thundering in my chest as I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I was just imagining things, that my mother's eyes hadn't really reflected the light like a predator's, that her smile hadn't really stretched too wide, that her fingers hadn't really twitched with a life of their own. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of her humming in the kitchen, her voice too bright, too cheerful, the melody sharp and discordant against the dull gray light filtering in through the windows. I forced myself to leave the safety of my bedroom, my pulse hammering in my ears as I crept down the hallway, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, the air thick with the cloying metallic scent of something burnt. She stood at the stove, her back to me, her head tilted at that familiar unnatural angle, her fingers moving in slow, precise circles over the chipped, stained countertop. "Morning," I whispered, my voice hoarse, my throat raw and tight. She turned, her eyes locking onto mine, the corners of her mouth twitching into a small, strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice too soft and too low, the words dripping with something dark and cloying. "I thought I'd make us breakfast." I glanced at the stove, my stomach turning as I caught sight of the pan, its blackened, greasy surface coated in a thick, bubbling sludge that oozed over the sides and dripped onto the cracked tiles below. Let me help you," I stammered, reaching for the pan, my hands trembling as I wrapped my fingers around the cool, greasy handle. Her eyes flicked to my hand, her pupils narrowing into a sharp, predatory slits, her lips pulling back in a slow, deliberate smile that revealed rows of too sharp, too white teeth. "No," she whispered, her voice a low, rumbling purr that set my teeth on edge. "I've got it." I froze, my pulse a frantic, erratic stutter in my ears, my skin tingling with that sharp, bitter tang of fear. For a moment, I thought I saw her shadow move, stretching and curling against the wall behind her, its edges fraying and flickering like a dying flame. I forced myself to breathe, to step back, to give her space, my mind racing with 1,000 half-formed, panicked thoughts as I stumbled back into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped, panicked bird. As I retreated into my room, the door clicking shut behind me, I felt her eyes on me, sharp and hungry, her gaze a heavy, suffocating weight that followed me into the darkness. The days blurred together, each one bleeding into the next in a dull gray haze of whispered words and too wide smiles. I stopped sleeping, the weight of her gaze pressing down on me like a physical force, her eyes always tracking my movement, her head tilting at those unnatural angles, her lips moving in silent, incomprehensible murmurs that echoed through my thoughts like the rustling of dead leaves in a cold wind. I tried to leave once, to flee the apartment and lose myself in the chaos of the city, but as I reached for the door, my fingers trembling on the cold tarnished knob, I felt her presence behind me, her shadow stretching across the wall like a twisted, grasping limbs of a forgotten creature. "Going somewhere, sweetheart?" she whispered, her voice low and sharp, her breath hot against the back of my neck. I turned, my pulse a frantic, stuttering drumbeat, and found her standing in the doorway of the living room, her head cocked to the side, her eyes glinting like a cat's in dim light, her teeth bared in a too wide smile that split her face from ear to ear. I forced a weak, trembling laugh, my hands slipping from the doorknob, my knees nearly buckling beneath me as I stumbled back a step, the cold, stale air of the hallway wrapping around me like a shroud. "Just getting some air," I whispered, my voice thin and reedy, my throat tight with fear. Her smile widened, corners of her mouth pulling back so far I thought her skin might split, the sharp white points of her teeth gleaming in the darkness. "Don't be silly," she crooned, her head tilting a fraction too far, the bones of her neck cracking and popping like dried twigs. "You don't need to go anywhere. I'm here. I'll always be here." I felt my stomach drop, a cold sinking sensation that twisted my insides like a wrung-out towel, and I forced myself to step back, my heels scuffing against the splintered floorboards as I turned and fled down the hallway, her soft, lilting laughter echoing after me like the distant wail of a storm. That night, the whispers grew louder, their hissing, chittering voices wrapping around my thoughts like grasping skeletal fingers. I heard them in the walls, in the creaking of the pipes, in the soft, rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat. They whispered of hunger, of darkness, of the thin, fragile line between the living and the dead, of the price I had paid for my mother's life, and the debt that had yet to be collected. I lay in my bed, my eyes wide and bloodshot, my breath coming in shallow, trembling gasps as the darkness closed in around me, the air thick with the cloying metallic scent of something ancient and forgotten. I felt her eyes on me, sharp and hungry, her gaze a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest, her breath a cold, crawling whisper that wound its way into my ears, filling my mind with images of cracked, blackened flesh, of sharp, glistening teeth, of two long fingers curling and uncurling in the darkness. I bolted upright and stumbled to the door, my hands fumbling for the handle as I shoved the door open and staggered into the hallway. She was waiting for me, her tall, slender frame silhouetted against the flickering light in the living room, her head tilted back, her eyes wide and unblinking, their pupils slitted like a predator's, their green depths glinting with a cold, unnatural light. For a moment, I thought I saw their shadow move, stretching and curling against the wall behind her. The shape too wrong, too many limbs, too many eyes, too many teeth. I stumbled back, my knees threatening to buckle beneath me as her head snapped forward. "You look scared, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice low and sharp, the words sliding through my thoughts like a blade through flesh. "You don't need to be scared." She took a step forward, her bare feet whispering against the cold, splintered floorboards, her fingers twitching at her sides, their too long and too thin lengths curling and uncurling. "I'm here," she whispered, her head tilting to the side, her eyes narrowing to sharp, predatory slits. "I'll always be here." I felt my back hit the wall, the cold, cracked plaster biting into my skin, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps as her shadow stretched toward me, its edges flickering and fraying, its two long limbs reaching out for me, and its too many eyes glinting in the darkness. And in that moment, I understood. The thing standing before me, the thing wearing my mother's face, the thing whispering to me in her voice, was not my mother. It had never been. It had taken her place, slipping into her empty, fragile shell, twisting her flesh into a mask, a disguise, a mockery of the woman that I had loved, the woman I had sacrificed everything to save. And now it was here, in my home, in my life, its two sharp teeth bared into a too wide smile, its two bright eyes tracking my every movement, its its two long fingers reaching for me in the darkness. I had called it. I had welcomed it. I had given it everything, and now I could never escape it. As the shadows closed in around me, there were too many limbs wrapped around my arms, my legs, my throat. I felt its cold, sharp fingers press against my chest, its two wide smiles stretching impossibly far as it whispered, for the last time, in my mother's voice, "I'll always be here, sweetheart." New Horizons City had always been a strange place, a sprawling neon-lit maze of concrete and chrome, its twisted alleys and crumbling overpasses clinging to the bones of an older, darker world. It was a place where the line between the possible and impossible had long since blurred, where the laws of physics bent and twisted beneath the weight of something older, something hungrier. It was a place of gods and monsters, and above them all, the savior of the city, the Titan. Every world with superhumans has its champions, its golden idols of truth and justice, its defenders of the weak and the downtrodden. But the Titan was something more, something greater, a figure so powerful, so untouchable, that even the darkest corners of the criminal underworld whispered his name with equal parts awe and terror. He had appeared a decade ago, a streak of silver and gold cutting through the smog-choked skies, his fists striking down the city's worst and most dangerous with the force of a meteorite. His voice a rumbling, earth-shaking roar that shattered windows and left lesser men trembling in their boots. The rain-soaked streets of New Horizons City had always smelled like metal and gasoline, a thick, cloying stench that clung to my clothes and burned the back of my throat with every breath. The neon lights of the downtown core flickered overhead, their harsh synthetic glow casting long, twisting shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement like the fingers of something half-dead, crawling up from the depths of the earth. I hunched my shoulders against the biting wind, my collar pulled high, my hat pulled low, the steady patter of rain drumming against the brim like the nervous tap of a prisoner's fingers against iron bars. I flicked the last smoldering inch of my cigarette into the nearby gutter, watching it sizzle and drown in the rising flood of rainwater before I turned my corner, my eyes narrowing against the harsh white glare of the police floodlights. The alleyway ahead was cordoned off, the familiar yellow tape fluttering in the wind like the tattered remnants of something long forgotten. Two uniforms stood guard at the entrance, their faces pale and drawn beneath the harsh artificial light, their hands hovering nervously over the butts of their sidearms. Detective Grant, one of them muttered as I approached, his voice muffled by the thick plastic sheen of his rain poncho. "You're not gonna like this one." I grunted, pushing past them without a word, the mud-slicked asphalt squelching beneath my boots as I stepped into the narrow, garbage-strewn alleyway. I had seen a lot in my 20 years on the force, the shattered remains of families torn apart by grief and betrayal, the twisted, bloated bodies of the desperate and the forgotten, the hollow, glassy-eyed stares of those who had lost everything to the cold, uncaring grind of the city's underbelly. But this was something different. The body lay sprawled against the graffiti-streaked brick wall, its limbs twisted at impossible angles, its torso splayed open like the petals of a grotesque, blood-soaked flower. The victim's face had been peeled back, the raw, glistening muscle exposed to the cold, driving rain, their eyes gouged out, their mouth frozen in a silent scream of agony. I crouched beside the body, my breath fogging in the chill night air as I leaned in closer, my gloved fingers brushing against the cold, wet concrete. And there, scrawled in the dark arterial red, just above the victim's shattered skull, was a symbol I had only seen once before. A crude, jagged spiral, its edges still wet and glistening, the thick, clotted blood seeping into the porous brick like ink on wet paper. I felt my stomach twist, a cold sinking sensation that spread from my gut to my fingertips, my pulse thundering in my ears as I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I snapped a series of photos, each flash of the camera illuminating the grisly scene in harsh, unflinching detail. I didn't need the medical examiner's report to know what I was looking at. This was a message, a warning, a threat, and I had a sick, sinking feeling I knew exactly who it was meant for. I stepped back from the body, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, my mind struggling to process the sheer brutality of the scene before me. The rain continued to pour, thick and relentless, washing the blood down the cracked brick wall in thin, dark rivulets that snaked their way into the cracks and crevices of the alley floor. I had seen my share of gruesome deaths in this city, gangland executions, ritual killings, the twisted, mangled remains of victims caught in the crossfire of turf wars and turf disputes. But this was something different. I fumbled for my notepad, my fingers trembling as I flipped it open and began scribbling notes, my eyes darting between the torn, splayed body and the dark, spiraling symbol carved into the wall above it. I had seen this symbol before. Not often, and never in the same part of the city, but enough to recognize the jagged, chaotic spiral, the harsh, angular lines that twisted in on themselves like the coils of some monstrous, writhing serpent. There had been another body like this, maybe 6 months ago, down by the old docks. A homeless man, his face peeled back like an orange rind, his chest cavity splayed open, his ribs cracked and spread like the wings of a broken bird. The same symbol had been carved into the brick wall beside him, the dark clotted blood still glistening in the weak, flickering light of the nearby street lamp. And then, a few months later, a second body, this one in the ruins of an abandoned subway tunnel deep beneath the city, the walls around it covered in the same twisted, spiraling symbols, their jagged and angular lines glowing faintly in the darkness, their meaning lost to time and madness. Each of the bodies had been posed, their limbs twisted and shattered, their mouths frozen in silent, gasping screams, their eyes gouged out, their flesh peeled back to reveal the glistening raw muscle beneath, each one a grotesque, bloody echo of the last. I glanced back down at the body at my feet, my pulse quickening as I took in the position of the limbs, the angle of the shattered bones, the carefully arranged entrails, the jagged, spiraling symbol carved into the wall above. It was a pattern, a ritual, and a message. But what the hell was it trying to say? I felt a shiver creep down my spine, the cold, prickling sensation of eyes on my back, of someone watching me from the shadows, its breath hot and wet against my neck, its fingers curling and uncurling in the darkness just beyond my field of vision. I straightened, my hand instinctively reaching for the comforting weight of my sidearm, my eyes darting around the alley, but nothing was there. I shook my head, forcing the fear to back down, shoving my notepad into my pocket as I turned on my heel and pushed my way back through the yellow tape, my boots slapping against the wet, slick pavement as I stumbled back into the cold, rain-soaked streets of New Horizon. Back at the precinct, I slumped into my chair, the cracked, worn leather creaking beneath my weight as I leaned back and scrubbed a hand over my face, my fingers still trembling, my skin clammy with sweat. I pulled up the case files, my eyes scanning the grainy black and white photos of twisted, mangled bodies, their empty eye sockets staring up at the camera, their gaping mouths frozen in silent, wordless screams of agony, each one a puzzle, a piece of a larger, darker picture that I had only just begun to glimpse. I leaned back, the old chair groaning beneath me as I flipped through the photos, my mind racing, my pulse a steady, thudding drumbeat in my ears as I traced the jagged, spiraling symbols with my fingertip. Their dark, chaotic lines seemed to pulse and writhe beneath my touch, their meaning just out of reach, their secrets locked away in the twisted, shattered remains of the dead. And then, as I stared at the photos, my eyes red and bleary with exhaustion, my mind numb with fear and confusion, I saw it. A pattern, a connection, a thread of dark, twisted logic that wound its way through the bodies, the symbols, the blood-soaked walls. Each of the victims had died on the same night, the same time, their bodies found in different corners of the city, their limbs twisted and shattered, their eyes gouged out, their flesh peeled back to reveal the glistening raw muscle beneath, each one a sacrifice, an offering. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my pulse racing, my skin prickling with the cold, sharp tang of fear as I reached for my phone. My fingers trembling as I dialed the number for the medical examiner, my mind racing, my heart thundering in my chest as the line rang, and rang, and rang. Because if I was right, if my theory was correct, if the jagged spiraling symbols meant what I thought they did, then I had just stumbled onto something much darker, much older, and much hungrier than anything I had ever imagined, and it was only a matter of time before it found me. I forced myself to focus, to push past the exhaustion, the nagging, prickling fear that had been gnawing at the back of my mind since that night in the alley, and flipped through the photos again, my eyes darting to one twisted, shattered corpse, and then the next, each one a grotesque echo of the last. The symbols, the spirals, the careful, deliberate positioning of the limbs, it all had to mean something, had to point to something, but what? I glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands frozen at 3:17, the thin black second hand twitching and shuddering against the cracked glass. I reached for my coffee, the bitter, lukewarm liquid burning my throat as I took a long, shuddering sip. I had been at this for hours, my mind spinning in tight, dizzying circles as I tried to piece together the scattered fragments of the puzzle. And then it hit me. I shoved the photos aside, my heart thundering in my chest as I reached for the old battered notebook I kept in my desk drawer, its leather cover cracked and frayed from years of use, its pages filled with the scrawled, half-legible notes of a dozen unsolved cases, their ink smeared and smudged with coffee, sweat, and the occasional splash of blood. I flipped through the pages. I scanned the names, the dates, the grim, clinical descriptions of shattered bones and twisted, splayed limbs as I pieced together the fragments of the truth. Each of the victims had died on the same night, the same time, their bodies found in different corners of the city, their limbs twisted and shattered, their eyes gouged out, their flesh peeled back to reveal the glistening, raw muscle beneath. Each one a sacrifice, each one an offering, and each one, I realized with a cold sinking dread, had died on the same night that the Titan had performed some great heroic feat, some city-shaking act of selfless bravery that had left the people of New Horizon cheering his name and the villains of the underworld trembling in fear. The Dreadstorm incident, the Blackout riots, the Day of Ash. Each one of Titan's greatest victories, each one of his most public, most celebrated acts of heroism, had been accompanied by a bloody, twisted offering. A broken, shattered body left to rot in the shadows of the city. I felt my stomach turn, a cold sinking sensation that twisted my insides like a wrung-out towel. Because if I was right, if my theory was correct, if the jagged spiraling symbols meant what I thought they did, then someone was trying to send a message to the Titan, to taunt him, to manipulate him, to push him to the edge and beyond. But who? And why? I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in years, I felt truly, deeply afraid. I spent the next few days poring over every scrap of information I could find, my office gradually transforming into a cluttered, chaotic labyrinth of crime scene photos, hastily scribbled notes, and crumpled coffee cups. The jagged, spiraling symbol haunting me at my every waking thought, its harsh, angular lines seeming to pulse and writhe beneath my gaze, its twisted, chaotic shape etched into the back of my mind like a brand. I started with the usual suspects, the rogues gallery of costumed freaks and genetically modified nightmares that had plagued New Horizon for years, each one more twisted and dangerous than the last. There was the Wraith, a shadow-walking serial killer who had carved his name into the city's underbelly with a pair of wickedly curved blades and a taste for fear. The Iron Widow, a technopath who had once tried to plunge the entire eastern seaboard into darkness with a fleet of weaponized drones. And of course, the Dreadstorm, the 7-foot insectoid nightmare that had nearly torn the city in half before the Titan had swooped in and ripped it apart with his bare hands. I combed through their case files, my eyes red and bleary with exhaustion. But there was nothing. No connections, no patterns, no hints of the jagged spiraling symbol that had become my waking nightmare, my every thought consumed by its dark, twisted lines, its harsh, angular curves. Frustrated, I expanded my search, diving deeper into the forgotten corners of the police database, the digital archives of the New Horizon Historical Society, the dusty, moth-eaten stacks of the city's oldest libraries, their yellowing pages filled with the desperate, terrified scrawlings of long-dead madmen and forgotten prophets. And that's when I found it. It was an old book, its cracked leather cover flaking beneath my fingers, its pages brittle and yellowed with age, the faint metallic scent of dried blood clinging to the paper like the forgotten memory of a nightmare. The book had no title, its spine cracked and warped, its pages filled with the cramped, hurried handwriting of a dozen different authors, each one adding their own frantic, terrified observations to the chaotic, spiraling mess of ink and blood-stained paper. The book spoke of gods and monsters, of ancient forgotten rituals, and the twisted, writhing creatures that lurked in the shadows of the world, their limbs stretching and curling through the cracks in reality, their too many eyes watching, their too long fingers grasping and pulling at the thin, fragile threads that held the universe together. And there, scrawled in the margins of one of the final pages, was the symbol, the jagged, spiraling mark I had seen carved into the brick walls of a dozen forgotten alleyways, its harsh, angular lines twisting and writhing across the brittle, yellowed paper like the limbs of some unseen, grasping creature. I felt my stomach twist, a cold, sinking sensation that spread from my gut to my fingertips. The symbol, the book claimed, was a mark of power, a sigil of control, a binding spell meant to draw the attention of something old, something hungry, something that fed on the fear and suffering of the living. And according to the frantic, ink-smeared scrawls that filled the margins of the page, the symbol was the mark of a creature known only as the Harbinger, a creature that had once nearly torn the world apart, its twisted, shattered remains scattered across the dimensions, its broken, shattered body bound to the cracks and crevices of the universe by the desperate, terrified hands of the ancient, long-dead gods who had once tried to hold it back. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my pulse racing, my skin prickling with the cold, sharp tang of fear as I forced myself to read on. My eyes darting from one cramped, hurried line of text to the next, my mind spinning, my heart thundering in my chest as I pieced together the shattered fragments of the truth. Because if the book was right, if the symbol was truly the mark of the Harbinger, then someone was trying to summon it, to draw its twisted, shattered body back into the world, to tear open the thin, fragile fabric of reality. But who and why? The days after blurred together in a haze of bitter coffee and sleepless nights, my mind spinning with half-formed theories and dark, twisted thoughts as I dug deeper into the mystery of the Harbinger. My office had become a chaotic labyrinth of scattered papers and grainy black and white photos, the walls plastered with maps and timelines, the jagged, spiraling symbols of the recent murders scrawled in dark, ink-stained lines across every available surface. The Harbinger. I whispered the name to myself as I flipped through the brittle yellow pages. I found my first real clue in the old water-stained journal buried in the archives of the New Horizon Historical Society. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Crow, a street preacher who had wandered the alleys and slums of New Horizon in the late 1900s, his words filled with fire and brimstone, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and madness. Crow's writings spoke of a figure known only as the Harbinger, a being of pure darkness, a creature that lurked in the deepest, blackest shadows of the city, its form that of a man, but devoid of all color and detail, like a silhouette cut from the fabric of reality itself. Crow described the Harbinger as a figure of absolute blackness, its limbs and torsos perfectly proportioned, its head featureless and smooth, save for the pair of softly glowing yellow eyes that burned in the darkness like the last flickering embers of a dying fire. There were no other features, no mouth, no nose, no ears, just the faint, ghostly glow of those eyes, their unblinking gaze fixed on the desperate, the broken, the mad. According to Crow's fevered writings, the Harbinger had first appeared in the city decades ago. its shadow stretching through the cracks and crevices of the world, its softly glowing eyes burning in the darkness like the baleful gaze of some ancient forgotten god. Crow claimed to have seen the Harbinger himself, glimpsed its dark, featureless form lurking in the shadows beneath the old crumbling bridges and forgotten subway tunnels of the city, its softly glowing eyes following him through the darkness. I felt a shiver creep down my spine, cold prickling sensation of eyes on my back, of something watching me from the shadows. I shook my head, forcing the fear to back down, and flipped to the final pages of the journal, my pulse racing. Crow's final entry spoke of the Harbinger's sudden, unexplained disappearance. And then, in a final frantic scrawl, Crow had written, "The Harbinger is gone, but it will return. It always returns. It cannot be destroyed, only delayed. It is a shadow, a hunger, a whisper in the dark, and it will return." And then I found it, the final chilling detail that twisted my stomach into knots and sent a cold crawling fear skittering down my spine. The last known sighting of the Harbinger had been nearly a decade ago, its dark featureless form glimpsed by a terrified, half-mad homeless man in the shadowed depths of an abandoned subway tunnel beneath the city. A decade ago, the same time the Titan had appeared. Had the Titan smited the Harbinger all those years ago? Was he back for revenge, slowly gathering his strength with each gruesome murder committed? His symbol fueling the forges of his power until he may one day stand against the Titan again. I spent the next few days combing through every police report, news clipping, and eyewitness account I could find, my office a chaotic mess. But the pattern was there, buried beneath the layers of fear and confusion, hidden among the shattered bones and twisted splayed limbs of a dozen forgotten victims. Their blood splashed across the cracked, crumbling walls of New Horizon like the desperate final plea of a dying city. Every time the Titan performed some great heroic feat, another body turned up in the shadows. It couldn't be a coincidence. The Harbinger had disappeared a decade ago, its featureless shadowed form slipping back into the darkness just as the Titan had first appeared, his streak of silver and gold cutting through the smog-choked skies, his fists striking down the city's worst and most dangerous with the force of a meteorite. And now, as I pieced together the shattered fragments of the truth, I realized that the Titan and the Harbinger are linked, their fates intertwined, their dark, twisted shadows stretching through the cracks and crevices of the city like the grasping skeletal fingers of a corpse. The only question was how. The fire broke out on a Monday, the thick black smoke billowing from the upper floors of the old crumbling office building like the breath of some ancient, long-forgotten beast. The Titan arrived within minutes, his golden cape billowing behind him like the wings of an avenging angel, his fists smashed through the crumbling concrete and twisted smoking steel, his eyes blazoned with a bright piercing blue light that cut through the darkness like the blade of a guillotine. He swept through the building like a force of nature, his every punch shattering walls, his every step shaking the foundations, his every scream a roar of defiance that echoed through the smoke-filled corridors like the howl of a dying god. I watched from the street below, my heart hammering in my chest, my pulse a frantic, erratic drumbeat in my ears as the flames roared around him, the thick choking smoke swirling in his wake, the broken, shattered bodies of the trapped and the dying tumbling from the shattered windows like the charred, blackened leaves of a dead tree. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The Titan burst through the crumbling facade of the building, a half-dozen survivors clutched in his powerful arms. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a deafening roar that drowned out the crackling of the flames, the creaking of the twisted smoking steel, and the distant wail of approaching sirens. I watched as the Titan set the survivors down, his two bright eyes sweeping over the crowd, his too perfect smile stretching across his chiseled features as he waved to the cameras, his fists still crackling with the faint electric residue of the fire's dying embers. This was it. This was the heroic feat that they all talked about. Tonight, I would comb the streets. It had to happen tonight. I just needed to know where. Shortly after the incident, I returned to the office to quickly rifle through the evidence. I studied every murder and where they happened. There seemed to be a pattern, and the next possible location was clear. That night, I would go to the area and see if I could find out who was committing these heinous acts. I spent the next few hours pacing the dark, rain-soaked streets of New Horizon. I didn't realize where I was until I had stumbled into the mouth of a narrow, garbage-strewn alleyway. I heard voices further down the alleyway, and then a yell for help. I quickly took my flashlight out and shined it down the alleyway. My worst nightmare came true as I saw the Titan stood at the far end of the alley. His back was to me, his broad muscular frame wreathed in shadow, his golden cape trailing behind him like the tattered remnants of a fallen god. And before him, pinned against the cracked, crumbling brick wall, was a man, his eyes wide and glassy with terror, his mouth twisted into a silent, gaping scream, his limbs twisted and shattered, his flesh peeled back to reveal the glistening raw muscle beneath, his blood splashed across the wall in jagged lines. I felt my stomach twist as a sinking sensation spread through my body. The Titan's head snapped around, his eyes locked onto mine, their blue light cold and sharp, their unblinking gaze a silent, unspoken threat that sent a cold, crawling fear skittering down my spine. I turned and ran, my boots slapping against the wet, slick pavement, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as the shadows seemed to grow around me, their edges lengthening around me as my world began to constrict. I felt a cold iron grip close around my arm, the bones of my wrist grinding together as the Titan spun me around, his eyes inches from my own, his smile stretching across his chiseled features as he leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "Detective Grant," he said with a curious wonder. "I was wondering when you would put it all together." His words teemed with cold calculation. "What?" I replied in a confused and bubbling panic. "I don't think I didn't know you've been on this case for years," he said, his smile never fading from his too perfect face. "I've been waiting for you to finally figure it all out. You see, this is what I like to call necessary sacrifices." "What do you mean?" I replied, my words choking through my nervousness, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm sure you're aware of the horrors that the Harbinger caused us all those years ago. Something just had to be done. For many years I was asking the same questions. How can we stop him?" he said as he began monologuing. "The solution was simple. We keep him caged. I have to keep him caged," he said, taunting me with his power. I don't understand. Where are you keeping him?" I asked, not ready for what came next. "Tisk, tisk, tisk. You still don't realize, do you?" he said as I saw the shadows begin to form around his arm, the one gripping my arm tightly. It crept up his shoulder and onto the left side of his face as it began to consume the half of him, his form silhouetting as his yellow eye showed through the pure void of his being. "I am the Harbinger," his words piercing through me as though ethereal. I felt the absolute zero of his being, his touch sending pure frost through my core, his grip forcing me to relive my worst nightmares as I watched in horror. I was then snapped back to reality. It was him all along. Titan and Harbinger were one. "You're gonna stay quiet, detective," he whispered, his voice low and sharp, his eyes narrowing as the darkness curled around him, its soft, glowing yellow eyes burning in the shadows. "Because if you don't, if you try to expose me, I'll tear this city apart. I'll rip it down to the bedrock, brick by brick, street by street, and I'll force you to watch." I felt my stomach flip, the dread washing through my body like a tsunami. He stared at me for what seemed like an hour before he loosened his grip and dropped me back to my feet. I staggered backwards, the rain dripping off me as I retreated back into the darkness, all the while his eyes locked on me. This was months ago, and now, every time I see him, every time I catch a glimpse of his eyes, his smile, his golden cape billowing in the smog-choked winds like the wings of a fallen angel, I feel his gaze on me, sharp and hungry. And sometimes, when our eyes meet, I swear I can see it. The darkness, the shadow, the harbinger itself, just beyond the surface. I see the soft glow of the terror, the fear, the pain. And I know, in that moment, that I am alone. I am trapped, and I'm the only one who knows the truth. No matter what I do, no matter how far I run, no matter how deeply I bury the truth, I will never be free of his gaze.